Welcome back, fellow armchair generals. This is Gamer1745 here with my continuing playthrough of Hearts of Iron 3 with Black Ice 9.1 and 1. That's it for mods. We're just playing straight Black Ice, and of course we're playing as Japan. Let's see what adventures, turmoils, conflicts are going to spring up for us. We're definitely not planning on any... Okay. Advanced land engineering. Now we can finally build fortresses. Don't know why Japan was thought not to have that. It's construction. It was this one, I think. Oh, no, here, this one here, advanced. We do pillboxes, but we couldn't do bigger fortresses. Why they thought not. Road construction. Well, let's do this. Yeah, we'll try to buy good relations with them, but no. So we were talking about Japan and its industrial expansion last episode. I sort of hit upon that, and I know I digressed a lot, and I don't plan on doing that this time, but I do feel I need to talk about something while we let the clock go. I think if I just start burning this super fast, I get uncomfortable and waiting for it. So this is probably, we may speed it up a little bit, but we'll see. So, we have the overall economic depression going on in the 30s, hitting different countries in different ways. Japan, at some point, does sort of start to pull out of it. And God, I'm far, and I do mean far from any sort of expert on... Okay, we're going to let this continue. On the Japanese economic situation. But they are... well, okay. Early 30s, late 20s, there's a major earthquake in Japan. Kills lots and lots of people, destroys a lot of Japan. But for good or for bad, a lot of the what it destroys are simple housing, simple homes. Japan's has had a long history with earthquakes, so they don't, you know. In the olden days, they didn't have earthquake, building regulations just because that didn't happen. I'm not talking now. I'm, in the 30s. I'm talking like in the olden days. Didn't have regulations like this, but they knew how to build structures to handle a lot of earthquakes. Obviously, you can always find something big enough magnitude that's going to collapse buildings and, cause real damage. Always, because you can always stream up and there's, big enough something or other. But there's a big devastating earthquake and kills a lot of people, puts a lot of people homeless and whatever, and I in no way want to make, and whatever, it's sort of like I'm making light of it. I'm not. But I do believe that relatively, now of course, how many days do you want to be homeless living in a street? One day is no good, so this isn't that, but it isn't, to my understanding, something that takes huge, long amounts of time to structurally rebuild people's homes and livelihood. It's bad. Those that get over it, and obviously those that don't. But we're also having a situation in where, and I'm sure we'll talk about this some more, I know it's paused right now, that food is a problem. Food is a problem in Japan. It is still a problem to this day in Japan in a way. Food is very expensive in Japan to this day. And we can go back to that it's very expensive because of protectionist agricultural food import policies in Japan. And there's some good reasons for it. I'm not saying that there are none, but there are some good reasons for it. One of them being, and this is one that always any nation needs to take into account, is strategic. Meaning rice, and this is where I was actually going to this day, is fairly expensive in Japan because it's done by a lot of small farmers. And now, my understanding, most of them in modern day today are industrialized in the sense, or mechanized. They've got a lot of mechanical help in doing it, but it's a lot of small scale machineries. Things maybe you write on whatever. But it's it's not a huge industrial combine. It's a small rototiller thingy or whatever. And as you can tell, I'm really up on all the details of farming and rice paddies and whatnot. But that it's going, and they protect these farmers to protect Japanese, partially for cultural reasons as well. So there's those two, to protect the agricultural industry in Japan. Now, of course, if you were to flood it, say, with a lot of Vietnamese rice, which is generally cheaper, maybe not quite the high quality as some of the Japanese rice, and I'm sure it depends, and I'm no connoisseur, but if you were to flood the market and put all the Japanese rice growers out of business, one, you would get rid of probably about 2/3 of them, and you'd be just out of business and gone. And probably half or more of the land that's being used would be put into use as a for growing rice, but on a larger, more industrialized, larger scale of economy, and do that. So that would be beneficial. Maybe not culturally, but economically beneficial. So you could do that. But what they're also worried about is to simply put them all, or enough of it, out of business with cheaper rice. I don't know necessarily always from where, though I do know Vietnam is a significant rice producer. They've gone back to capitalism in Vietnam. The communists in China and the communists in Vietnam have both figured out that capitalism works better than that communist stuff. So, yeah. Just to all of you that get educated in America and maybe in Western Europe about the wonders of communism, is the communists figured it out. It don't work. They keep mouthing off about it that run countries, but they all do capitalist economics of one degree or another. Not necessarily pure capitalism, but that kind of thing. So, but you don't want Japan, or Japan as a national interest doesn't want all of its food to be imported to then be subject to, let's say there's some sort of rice blight. Thinking of the potato blight in Ireland that killed off most of the potatoes, which the Irish people needed. It didn't affect the grains, mostly wheat, that Ireland made that was sold to England. So the Irish people starved. Well, they don't want, and I don't know if there is a rice blight or something, but they don't want something that would maybe hit Vietnam and then go, oh shit, what are we going to eat? It's not like, maybe try to import stuff from China. Well, China needs its rice, and I'm sure it can export some. But, it's a strategic asset, and that's the reason that is always valid, in my opinion, for I'm trying to put this, not for any protectionist laws, but for protectionist laws that are needed for strategic reasons. That's always a potential, again, because you could overly do it. Protect an industry, maybe like your rice growers, that should be pared down by some level, because you don't want to have inefficiency, but you want to not force all of the rice producers out of business from your nation. So it's there's always a balancing act there. Whether cultural reasons for protection are valid, no, that's a decision the nation needs to make, and maybe nations will make that decision. It's it's that kind of thing. So getting back to where we sort of started with Japan, high quality premium white rice is sort of the ideal food. And I'm not talking about some fancy sushi or something that's really sort of maybe expensive, but that was sort of the staple product. Well, in Japan at this time, a lot of people really can't afford the white rice. They either have cheaper brown rice or millet or some other kind of stuff that's sort of turned more into a dough. Again, as you can tell, I'm a real big expert on this. I'm saying sarcastically here, but so a lot of people I mean, there's levels of starvation. There's levels of, particularly girl children are not as valued, so they're often sold into a slavery situation, in that they're sold to somebody else. They're now, they're not old enough to be their own legal guardians, shall we say. They're not selling 18-year-olds. They're selling like 5-year-olds or 10-year-olds or something like this, and often into being prostitutes, and not the geishas, as most of us who study know that geishas are not prostitutes, but prostitutes are often dressed like geishas. So it can be confusing, and this was even pre-war time period kind of things like this. So there's a lot of struggle going on economically in Japan, and even for food levels of being able to feed people is a struggle in Japan. Now, like I say, that they are getting some economic growth. What they're doing, and part of what they're very much doing, is encouraging Japanese to migrate into their colonial possessions. Korea for a long time, Formosa, which had not been Japanese, I think just for about 50 years or so it had been Japanese, but also down into Saipan and some of these other places. They're trying to encourage the Japanese to move there, and more recently moving into Manchukuo as colonists, as settlers. Now, I don't know what the Japanese long-term viewed. They weren't plans to giving up Korea. There definitely wasn't plans of giving up Formosa. And the Pacific Islands, a lot of these, is talked to a few of you, know that these are way out of scale, but just to make it so that we can sort of click on them with ease, is what they're sort of rough geographically set up here. Now sometimes these are just one provinces, and so most of these are really, really small. A few ones like Saipan are actually fairly large. Here's Saipan again. Fairly large-ish, but they're not going to house huge numbers of people, but still they're trying to colonize, and they're obviously not planning on giving up that anytime soon. I really don't know what the Japanese thought. And here's my best estimate. There was no clear plan, because we've looked at military aggression already in China, generally speaking, and that's what everything beyond Korea is sort of ad hoc and done by local military types. There was no ideological or governmental policies like we will find in Nazi Germany for expansion, for Lebensraum. Now, once you got it, they're trying to put in Japanese settlers, but they aren't expanding for that reason, is to the best of my understanding. Like I say this, and as I'm saying this, I'm wondering, well, there may be a few theorists around, but none of this expansion into Manchuria and then down in these various parts into China, and then the big push, is ever really directed even militarily, from Japan. It's always sort of locally, and then it's like, oh shit, what do we do about them? They've either been really successful or they're struggling. We got to pour in some more troops because we won't want to lose face. So it's sort of an ad hoc. Being pulled, the tail is wagging the dog, if you will. It's being pulled in that sense, and so that's my thought on it. And if there was enough Japanese pushed in, I don't know that there would ever be enough, because there's a lot of local populace, and I don't know that somehow, be a majority or such a significant minority that they would somehow feel the okay, we have batteries, we'll do batteries next. Feel the idea that they now need to take over, more direct, make it part of Japan or something like that, as opposed to a puppet state. Korea was not a puppet state. It was a sort of direct colony. There is a difference. And so Japan is expanding into Manchuria, heavily industrializing Manchuria. Manchuria, to the best of my knowledge, is very unindustrialized when the Japanese move into there. The Manchus are, I'm probably going to get this wrong to some degree, but to some degree I would sort of categorize them as Chinese Mongols or whatever, and that's in that they're, they're Manchurian Chinese, which I guess are different than the Han Chinese from some of my readings, or I don't know how different, but they sort of see themselves as different. But they're sort of horse riding, pastoral people, more so than farming people. No, I'm sure they did farming up here. They're not quite the Mongol steppe horseman types, but more so. My understanding, the further south you get in China, the more rice-based the diet is, but even as far south as you sort of go in China, there is still a noodles, which is basically a wheat or of some sort, based, though I think you can sort of, I'm trying to think here, another area I don't know is cooking, but turn rice, well, I know you can turn rice into a paste, and I guess you could maybe turn it into a noodle, I don't know, but is more of a noodle base, or more of a rice based diet. Where you come up in the north, it's much more of a wheat and noodle type based diet. Mostly, I think, and I'm probably going to get another thing wrong, is not a direct sort of what we in Europe or whatever would think of as a bread diet. And again, I'm probably wrong on that, but that is my understanding of China there. So these people are culturally different than these Cantonese down here. As in culturally different between a Swede and an Italian. Now they're both Europeans, Swedes and Italians, but they are different. So it's that sort of kind of thing. So I'm trying to explain that they're different, and my understanding of their differences. We want to do that eventually. Okay, well, we're going to come over here and improve our submarine some more, because we have some more 36 technologies. Let's get periscopes cranking. And so, and to the best of my understanding, there is not a concerted effort to colonize a certain tight geographical location with Japanese as into like carve out a, like we would see here that this was, of course, Port Arthur that's coming. I don't know if Dalian is the Japanese name, the Chinese name, or whatnot, but this very much, former Russian area, very much might be highly colonized by Japanese, but there isn't other geographical areas that they're trying to be exclusionary of locals and to just bring in the Japanese. They're trying to bring in the Japanese to set up Japanese-based farms, Japanese-managed, labor and other work. And so this really helps Japan grow. Okay, monumental architecture. And nope, we're over here. And 38, stop that. And broadcasting advance. That is also now 38, so we're stopping that. Submarines. And we still have one more. Okay, we'll do air defense. As I think in this series, but sometimes it may be in the other series of Japan, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself a lot. A lot of the Japanese that were colonizing, and a lot of the Japanese soldiers came in and surprisingly found themselves unwelcome And they often talk about the barely disguised, I don't know if they used the word hatred or dislike or what was it from the locals. Because a lot of these people were coming in with the Japanese propaganda and sort of the impressions that they're giving in Japan as to the locals' reaction to them, and they're finding out the locals really aren't pleased with the Japanese. At a minimum, and this is sort of in their words, that the people feel that they've just been, they've just shifted overlords. And these are often some of this stuff was in regards to the Chinese a bit further south once they, sort of kick some of the Europeans out of down there. But I really think it just, and I don't know in all cases, but one area I'm not as familiar with maybe as I should be is the reaction of the Indonesia, because I gather Sukarno, the longtime dictator of Indonesia, I guess was a Japanese puppet guy for a while, and so where that is different than my experience or knowledge based on French Indochina. In which the nationalistic types in Indochina are as much or even more anti-Japanese than they are anti-French. The French are very concerned about the support that the Americans want to give guerrilla movements in Indochina because, hey, they want to rule there afterwards, and they know that these independence movements aren't pleased with them either, but so they're worried about that. But the Americans are just looking at shortening the war, and the American interest is not. This is one thing that the British very much know and are concerned about throughout the whole war. The American interests are not to maintain the British Empire. Now, of course, the American interests are pro-Western and want to see pro-Western governments set up in Asia, in the East, so that you can see the dichotomy of that. But they're not there to try to enforce European rulership. Now, of course, as time goes on, they see that it becoming more in an East-West conflict of the sense of communist guerrilla movements versus colonial oppressors. Well, they're going to go with the colonial oppressors because they're not communists. So, otherwise, trust me, if it wasn't that, there would have been no U.S. support, as there was significant U.S. support for the French in Indochina. There wasn't, ground forces or whatnot, but there's lots of materiel type support to help the French out and maintain their colonies in Indochina, but it wasn't to maintain European rule. It was to stop communist rule, which to a degree they see, the West sees that as simply a different set of Europeans, those based out of Russia instead of those based out of Paris. Okay, improve security units. Is that down? Oh boy, how many times have I played this? Over here, yeah, 1940, boy, right in the center. Okay, well, I still want to. I'm going to probably in 37 start moving much more to the generate more and more officers as 37 starts. I hope not to have too high of officer casualties versus the Chinese, and I'm not looking at them as a tough opponent, which may be a mistake, but we just had a crash on a autosave, so I don't know why that happened. Okay, well, that takes some looking into. Thanks for watching. Thanks for liking the videos. I know it's a bit short. Being back next time, hopefully for more Hearts of Iron.